Just 75 years ago this week, Micheal O'Hare, one of the great legends of Irish broadcasting, gave his first running commentary on a GAA game. Micheal O'Brien, the Abbey actor, was one of those who could recall how Gaelic games commentary was listened to, communally by groups of neighbours who would foregather at some house, lucky enough or unlucky enough to have a wireless receiver, and who thereby became host, willingly or otherwise, to the local GAA fans. And he could vividly recall his first experience of listening into a match. This was the previous summer to O'Hare's first broadcast.
It was September 1937 in Conlon's in Ballintaggart in Spidale. I remember walking up the Boreen up to it with some farmers. I didn't know much about it, but they asked if they wanted to hear the result of the match at the time. And some people were standing outside at the Beanie Tea, the able end of the house. And anyway, we walked in, and it was about 7:15, or around 7 o'clock. And we went in, and Tom 14 Tom was there, and Jim 14 Neddy, and Paddy O'Donnell, and Tom O'Howe, local, Lord of mercy, they're nearly all dead now. And I saw this box. I never thought, and I thought it was the wonder of the Western world, really. And the old people said, far he's Killarney, man down in Killarney, we can hear him here, And it was one of the old radio sets with the dry battery and a wet battery, you see, and a thing outside, the condenser. I think there were only four sets in the parish at the time. The doctor or the master or the parish priest, but we wouldn't go to those houses, of course. I mean, this was an open house of for everybody. Well, that was my first experience of radio, and I thought it was wonderful.
If anything, Micheal O'Brien was even more impressed the following year. Here he gives a listener's perspective to the young Micheal O'Hare, 1938, his first year as a match commentator.
We went up to Conlon's again. Crowd. It was an open house, door open, and went in and into the parlours, as they call it. It was crowded. And a young voice came on the radio, you see. We had never heard before. We didn't hear anything that was going to be a new person on, because we hadn't read the papers. It was 14th of August, and as I said, and this young voice came on, and everybody kind of wondered, who's this fella, you see. He gave his name, but it didn't mean anything to us. Micheal O'Hare didn't mean a thing to us. I'm sure there was praise. He was only a young kid, 16 years of age, which we all know now.
Micheal O'Hare was very young. He'd like to tell the story of how he landed the job. He told it many times, and here's the account he gave to Ian Corr.
Well, one Monday, I wrote a letter to Dr. Kiernan, the then Director of Broadcasting in Radio Éireann, and asked him for a test as a broadcaster, a commentator. And on the following Friday, I got on the post a letter telling me that there were final tests in Croke Park the following Sunday, and would I please report for testing. And I honestly knew nothing about any series of tests that had been held, and I turned up with my school cap, my school blazer, and my grey flannels, and I was there to do the test. There were, I think, 5 of us altogether, and each was asked to do 5 minutes of the first half. At half-time, Dr. Kiernan, who was the Director of Broadcasting, as I say, he got through from the GPO and asked that the man, mark you, man, who did the last 5 minutes, would he do the second half? Well, I was the man who did the second half, and that was that. I went off about my business, back to school the following day, and a week passed, a fortnight passed, and there was nothing. And one morning, I got off my bicycle on my way into O'Connell's and found a telephone and rang through and asked for the director and asked him, what about the tests? And he said, the very man. He said, I was just going to write to you. I wonder, could you get off from work for a little while tomorrow and come in and we'll have a chat? So the following day, I mitched from school, went in to the GPO, and as I sat waiting to go in to see Dr. Kiernan, all the time it was in my mind, I must have got this job or whatever it is. But when he sees I'm so young, now I was only 18 and looked an awful lot younger. I was wondering when he saw me, would he say too young? But anyway, I went in and he looked up at me and he smiled and then said, would you sit down? And he started to talk about the test and suggested that I give the score more often, that I do this or do that, and would I do the Leinster football final of that year. Well, subsequently that football final broadcast was cancelled, and my first broadcast was to be the 14th of August in Mullingar between the Ulster champions Monaghan and the Connacht champions Galway. And indeed, to freshen myself up on the Monaghan team, I'd gone up to see the Ulster final that was between Monaghan and Armagh, and a tough game it was too.
He came to the Ulster final, obviously to meet the people about whom he'd be speaking in the All-Ireland semi-final, which was going to be the first match that he would broadcast.
Rory Johnson of the Monaghan team admired the young O'Hare's approach to his homework.
And I remember him quite well as a young, well-set-up young fellow. I think he had just left school. He must have been only around about 18 years of age. We were introduced to him. I little thought at that time that this person was destined to become the voice of the GAA and probably the best known voice on Radio Air in the next 40 or 50 years.
In another archive programme from the sports department and presented by Philip Green, Micheal O'Hare recalled that first commentary and the encouragement he had got from Jimmy Mahon, who was the outside broadcasting engineer on that occasion.
For that first broadcast, and I have the contract still at home, I received the sum of £3 10 shillings, and that was to include my expenses to get to Mullingar. And during the match, I kept going on and on and on, as usual, talking about all the action and everything else, and my late father was sitting outside the box, and I think it took more out of him, the actual broadcast, than it did out of me. Mm-hmm. But there are a couple of aspects of that broadcast that I never forget. The technician was Jimmy Mann.
I was with him, and about halfway, or near halfway through, I think, I passed him a note. I don't know whether he has it yet or not, but it went something like this: "You're doing great," or something like that.
And I remember at half-time he sent over a little label that I have at home still, and written on it was, "Keep going the way you are, it's going fine."
But when it was over, the soul-searching began, the doubts crept in.
Coming home in the train, I was absolutely convinced that I was after making the greatest fool of myself that anybody could imagine. And I sat in the carriage with my father, and I don't know how many other people were there, but not one word would I say. And I was still convinced until I got to the corner of Ormond Road where I lived. And we had a very great friend, Tommy Riley, who, if something was good or something was right, Tommy would enthuse over it. And if something was bad or something was terrible, Tommy would knock it. Not for the sake of knocking, but for your own sake. He was probably the greatest friend that I ever had outside my own family. Tommy was at the corner to meet me and put his arms around me and say, "Well done." And the next thing, newspaper reporters started coming, and I began to think, God, it mightn't have been too bad after all.
And letters in the national press, like this one, endorsed that opinion.
Irish Independent, 17th of August, 1938. "Let me broadcast the match," said Michael Hare, and he did so in delightful fashion. He used no hackneyed phrases. He held his listeners spellbound. His history of the individual players in his preliminaries was exceptionally well done. No pauses, no corrections, no doubts. He gave his commentary with ease and versatility. His chuckling laugh at the ubiquitous Flavin, his narration of friendly handclasps of two of the players at the request of the referee, and his message to Skerries at the well-being of their own favourite Bobby Beggs, added a touch of humour in keeping with his distinctly pleasing voice. He is a refreshing discovery, and I congratulate him on his success. P.J. Hayes, South Main Street, Wexford.
O'Hare recalled that in his early years as a broadcaster, he would picture in his mind's eye a man called Patrick Gary from Ballycorrig in Clare, bedridden, and so O'Hare would tell him the story of the match. Here from the archives is Micheal O'Hare himself.
One terror that a commentator can get is the feeling that he is talking to thousands upon thousands of people. And this was something that struck me very soon after I had been told I was going to do a broadcast. And there was down in Clare, in a place called Ballycorrig, up on top of a hill, a man called Patrick Gary, who used to go all over the country to matches, but of late had become stricken with arthritis and he couldn't travel anywhere. And for the first few years of broadcasting, I used to talk in commentaries to Patrick Gary. I didn't talk to the people in Ireland or anywhere else. I spoke to Patrick Gary, trying to tell him what was happening. And that way, somehow, it seemed to develop a style that the people liked.
Back to Micheal O'Brien, listener, Connemara, 1938, O'Hare's first broadcasts.
And next thing, the first thing he gave us the score of the minor. That's the call. We were badly beaten by Kerry. And the people were all staring at each other. And Galway started off. It was tight enough going. You know, we were all mad, kind of mad for Galway to win, naturally. And things were going very well for us, but on occasions, there were, one time we were leading by 4 points at half time, and then 10 points, but Monaghan came back at us. And the reaction and his commentary, you know, like, I mean, he knew everything, little details he gave us that we never got before. Like we know now that he was the man that, he must have done his homework, you see, that he knew everything about every player and their background and how many county champions they had, and many railway cups, and what everybody was. We were spellbound by this man this day. Anyway, it was my wish from there to see Croke Park, to see two teams playing, even, you know. And I anyway, the 13th of August, 1939, I cycled in on a Sunday morning, met my sister in Galway. She was in Clostane, yeah? And I got mass, got the train to Dublin, and my fare was 4 and 6pence. My brother met me, and he brought me to Croke Park. And, of course, Kerry and Mayo were playing. Galway wasn't playing. Kerry and Mayo playing All-Ireland semi-final. I was kind of disappointed in the game. But I wasn't watching the game as much as I was watching the surroundings. You see, Micheal O'Hare's box and the little Hogan stand and the long stand and the little stand at the right-hand side. This was the Cusack stand. Now, we were under the Cusack stand, you see, and as you know, it was built in 37, maybe 36, because the All-Ireland hurling final was played in Killarney. They couldn't play it in Croke Park that year because they were building the Cusack stand. And the pitch was so level and so green, and the pitch was so marked out, you know, which we hadn't. I mean, you know what, lad, we have at home. And the goal post, the netting that I liked very much, and the sideline men togged out, and the flags, the goal posts, you see, and the green flag and the white flag, and the seniors All Ireland football final day, it ended in a draw, 4 points all, 4 points Mayo, 4 points, and I used to get what I watched mostly that time was Joe Keohane and Tommy Hope and Claire watching each other, you know, and. It was the thrill of my life, and then I came back again the following year, but there were 2 All-Ireland semi-finals played that time, and Galway and Mayo, Galway and Meath, and Kerry and Cavan, and it's the same, you see, because that's what I mean about the O'Hare, like, I mean, it was every young fella's dream, and old people, to play or to see Croke Park.
And that feature on Micheal O'Hare was to mark the 75th anniversary of his first broadcast, his first running commentary on a GA match in August 1938. Micheal O'Hare, the voice of Summer Sundays 60, 70, 80 years ago, was born just 100 years ago on the 2nd of June 1920. Some people credited him with building Croke Park. he certainly had a major role in popularising Gaelic games.
Being tackled by Ty Kelly, getting it in a bit to Tom Cheesy. Cheesy lets it run through. Corn has it 14 yards out. He takes a shot and it's the goal.
His approach to commentating differed from so many others.
Micheal O'Hare, even the name suggests excitement, a promise of drama, a guarantee of atmosphere.
This is GAA Secretary-General for so many years, Sean O'Sheacoin, on O'Hare's appeal.
If Micheal was a painter, he would be of the Impressionist school. His images are not just those which he sees, but those that he wants his audience to see. And although the majority of the O'Hare broadcasts have been on radio, his supreme talent is that his listening audience does see the game. Maybe it's not exactly the game the attendance at the venue sees. Oh, the scores and the scorers are the same, the result is the same, but the game for the listening audience is different, because Micheal O'Hare is playing in their game.
Micheal O'Brien, like so many other listeners in the 1930s, listened communally. Not everybody had a radio set. In 1937, and just before O'Hare's career began, Micheal O'Brien had been struck by the wonder of radio.
And I saw this box. Oh, I never thought, and I thought it was the wonder of the Western world, you know, really. And the old people said, oh, far he's a Killarney, man down in Killarney, we can hear him here, you know.
Now in 1938, he was again joining his friends in Galway for the Sunday commentary.
It was crowded, and a young voice came on the radio, you see. We had never heard before. We didn't hear anything that was going to be a new person on, because we hadn't read the papers. Like, I mean, it was 14th of August, and as I said, and this young voice came on, and everybody kind of wondered, who's this fella? You see, he gave his name, but it didn't mean anything to us. Micheal O'Hare didn't mean a thing to us.
This was O'Hare's introduction to Radio Éireann listeners.
His commentary, you know, like, I mean, he knew everything.
They were impressed.
Oh, what? Everybody was, we were spellbound by this man.
Everybody mentioned O'Hare's prodigious homework.
But from speaking to people afterwards who had been listening to him, it would seem that he had done an immense amount of homework.
If O'Hare was being appreciated by so many clusters of listeners who had foregathered for communal listening at a house which had a wet battery radio, O'Hare was imagining himself addressing a single listener.
One terror that a commentator can get is the feeling that he is talking to thousands upon thousands of people. And this was something that struck me very soon after I had been told I was going to do a broadcast. And there was down in Clare, in a place called Ballycorrick, up on top of a hill, a man called Patrick Gary, who used to go all over the country to matches, but of late had become stricken with arthritis and he couldn't travel anywhere. And for the first few years of broadcasting, I used to talk in commentaries to Patrick Gary. I didn't talk to the people in Ireland or anywhere else. I spoke to Patrick Gary, trying to tell him what was happening. And that way, somehow, it seemed to develop a style that the people liked.
Rory Johnson was one of the Monaghan team who had met the young O'Hare when he had gone to an earlier match, the better to recognise the Monaghan players.
And I can see him now as I say, a young schoolboy, or just an ex-schoolboy, and fairly well set up, with a rather angelic-looking face. And I think he had curly hair and a smiling face now, much the same as he has today, as a matter of fact.
In the 1930s, the GAA was still working hard to establish the popularity of Gaelic games. It had been the Irish press, after its launch in September 1931, which had done much to win media and press attention for hurling and Gaelic football. Radio Éireann, with its running commentaries on Sunday afternoons, had further helped this popularity.
You go home to your landlady and you say, you might think the match was mediocre, you know, and you go home and the landlady said, that was a powerful, great game, and it wouldn't be that good a game, but he made it good.
He was the kind of a person who generated and communicated excitement, whether the excitement was there or not.
And he became famous for this approach.
From his point of view, it was an entertainment.
His sometime colleague and fellow commentator, Fred Cogley.
He was entertaining listeners. He was getting listeners to stay with him. So much so that the match was a kind of an incidental. It was his material for making a very good broadcast. So you were getting a different thing. You weren't necessarily getting the match, because the match could be as boring as hell. But you were never going to get a boring broadcast from Michael O'Hare.
Being tackled by Ty Kelly, getting it in a bit to Tom Cheesy. Cheesy lets it run through. Carl has it 14 yards out. He takes a shot, and it's the goal.
As a schoolboy, he had wanted to be a sports commentator.
Well, one May Monday, I wrote a letter to Dr. Kiernan, the then Director of Broadcasting and Radio Éireann, and asked him for a test as a broadcaster, a commentator. And on the following Friday, I got on the post a letter telling me that there were final tests in Croke Park the following Sunday, and would I please report for testing. And I honestly knew nothing about any series of tests that had been held, and I turned up with my school cap, my school blazer, and my grey flannels, and I was there to do the test. There were, I think, 5 of us altogether, and each was asked to do 5 minutes of the first half. At half-time, Dr. Kiernan, who is the Director of Broadcasting, as I say, he got through from the GPO and asked that the man, mark you, man, who did the last 5 minutes, would he do the second half? Well, I was the man who did the second half, and that was that. I went off about my business, back to school the following day, and a week passed, a fortnight passed, and there was nothing. And one morning, I got off my bicycle on my way into O'Connell's and found a telephone and rang through and asked for the director and asked him, what about the tests? And he said, the very man. He said, I was just going to write to you. I wonder, could you get off from work for a little while tomorrow and come in and we'll have a chat? So the following day, I mitched from school, went in to the GPO, and as I sat waiting to go in to see Dr. Kiernan, all the time it was in my mind, I must have got this job or whatever it is. But when he sees I'm so young, now I was only 18 and looked an awful lot younger, I was wondering when he saw me, would he say too young? But anyway, I went in and he looked up at me and he smiled. And then said, would you sit down? And he started to talk about the test and suggested that I give the score more often, that I do this or do that. And would I do the Leinster football final of that year? Well, subsequently, that football final broadcast was cancelled, and my first broadcast was to be the 14th of August in Mullingar between the Ulster champions Monaghan and the Connacht champions Galway.
Colm Keane, in his documentary on the Micheal O'Hare phenomenon, spoke to a number of GAA players and fans about O'Hare. Individually, the contributors were not named. The voices and the contributors were intercut, but Colm Keane did list them for the record.
And there are comments too from Kerry footballers Wishy Fogarty and Johnny Cullity, and also Mick O'Neill, William Kennefick, Dan Griffin, John Kennedy and Donny Sheehan.
Well, my earliest memories of Micheal O'Hare is going back to about 1950, we say, when I was a young man, and we were fortunate enough to have a radio in the house, and on the Saturday before the big game, I'd have to take the wet battery and the dry battery and take it to the local creamery, which was a mile away, and to get those 2 batteries charged in order that everything was ready for the match on the Sunday. It would be a big match, and of course the commentator would be the great Micheal O'Hare. Now, half an hour before the match started, the crowd would gather, and they'd be everywhere. They'd be around the house, they'd be up the stairs, and if the weather was fine, the window was open and the radio was put out in the window. Volume full blast, and you'd hear that match all around the locality.
I'd go to the local bar here, and we'd go into the back room. There'd be about 15 in the room. But we'd gather around the radio maybe 3:15 before the game had started 1:30. And we'd be in the back room, and Nathan would be going on about the game and who was going to win. And then as soon as the game started, you could hear a pin drop, and Balla Year of Galera Carda, Micheal O'Hare come down. I've often thought of it as sitting down with good company, a good pint, and listening to Micheal O'Hare. We were millionaires for a couple of hours.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. Welcome wherever you may be. Welcome to join us here in Croke Park, Dublin, on this All-Ireland hurling final day. And as we come on the air, we look down on a glorious sun beating down beautifully on the Artane Boys Band, the Pipers Band, and the men from Wexford and the men from Cork marching round this crowded arena here as a preliminary to the game that could well be the game of the century.
First of all, he went around the grounds with you and he told you about the crowd and what Hill 16. If the Dubs were playing, of course, there'd be only one colour in the hill. That'd be the blue of the Dubs. Nobody else, of course, we were going to Hill 16. Then he told you about the field and the way it was lined out. Then he told you about the referee and where he came from and what club he was involved in, if he played himself, and then he told you about the players.
One of his greatest attributes was that he could name the player, the club he played with, the county championship team he played with, and the townland he came from.
Well, one of the things I remember about him, another one of the things I remember about him was when he'd be broadcasting the matches, he'd be talking about Radio Brazzaville, he'd be talking about the Congo, and he'd be talking about friends in America, and he'd be talking about friends all over Ireland. And to the young people of Ireland growing up at that particular time, of course, the world was very, very small. We had no internet, we had no television, everything was very, very small. But when you hear Micheal here talking about the Congo, and you'd hear him talking about Radio Brazzaville, we still don't know where Radio Brazzaville was, by the way, but we believed him anyway, because all we were interested in was Kerry and what he was going to say about Kerry, and then he'd incorporate all these far-flung places all over the world, and then he'd be rattling off names, and he was a great man, of course, for the missionaries. He'd always say about the priests here and the priests there, which was a very nice thing, and it is always nice to remember those people, and they rely so much, the missionaries out foreign, of course, in Ireland, so many people foreign, but Micheal O'Hare never forgot those. But yes, when we do talk about those far-flung places, and that's the words he'd say about those far-flung places, and then next thing he'd rattle them off. Do you know what? He educated a lot of people too.
And so with that singing of our national anthem, we greet Gaels throughout the world, eastwards in Africa through Radio Brazzaville and westwards through New York station WNBC, and the game is on. And the first man to break away is Christy Ring. A long shot down the field is brought down by Willie Rackard of Wexford. He breaks away, he's held, and there's a free for Wexford 50 yards from their own goal, out in the centre of the field. Wexford defending on our left, the railway goal, and Cork defending on our right, the canal goal. And Willie Rackard takes the free, a long high ball, way up the field. Martin Codd is under it, he doubles on it. The ball goes out loose onto the wing to Tim Flood. Flood takes a shot, and there is the first score of the game.
The bishops would throw in the ball, and he could describe in a lovely low voice. He could drop his voice up and drop it down. He'd describe about, we say, the Bishop of Kerry, Bishop Moynihan, the late Bishop Moynihan, Latimer, the Kerry County Championship Cup, by the way, is called after him. Bishop Moynihan strolling out onto Croke Park, and John Dowling, the Kerry footballer, kneeling down, kissing his ring, and the opposing captain would do the same thing. But he could tell that little story more than anybody else could tell it. He could describe those little things to me, they remain to me more than anybody else. But he had to have that live picture, I reckon myself, to be able to carry it across. Recordings to him, I'd say, they were only all just second best.
One characteristic remembered by many of them and commented upon by them was Micheal O'Hare's voice.
And he cuts to the high one, it's deflected in towards the goal mouth, right across the goal, Pat Nolan gets it, and the forwards are, it's a goal! It's a goal! Tom Malotny! Exactly, 55 seconds gone, and Tom Malotny has a goal for Tipperary. Tip, one goal. And the puck out goes about 20 yards out to Tom Malotny, a very short one. He gets it out on the side to Sean McLaughlin. McLaughlin goes in, he takes the shot, and it's another goal! It's another goal! The time, 1 minute, 20 seconds.
Micheal O'Hare's greatest characteristic was his voice. And he had a kind of a shrill kind of a voice that changed and brought you kind of, it was like a musical voice, bringing you up to a crescendo and bringing you to the height of the excitement as he seen it and generated it to you. He was, I suppose, it was a special gift. Many people have tried it since, and I've heard characters at different games and they're trying to take off the Micheal O'Hare voice. I suppose if you could describe Micheal O'Hare in one word, you would say the voice, because he did have a special voice.
Michael O'Hare's voice, I think, appealed to everybody. Nobody could ever see anyone. In fact, I can't ever remember anybody that has the same appeal to people. Perhaps McCormack. You know, McCormack and Michael O'Hare's voice have been compared. I know one is a singing and the other is a speaking voice, but there's something in both of them. If you hear Michael O'Hare's voice, you never forgot it. Had a terrific appeal. I suppose it was actually the amount of work he put into the thing. I mean, no doubt about it, he certainly put in a lot. He knew all the players, he knew everything, he had everything off pat. But nothing has been the same since he went. Muircehartaigh is very good, I suppose you could say he's following in his footsteps, but nobody can touch Micheal here at all. It's just like, again, as I said, McCormack, nobody can touch McCormack. There's something in that voice that appeals, there's something in it that we possibly don't understand what it is even, but it certainly appeals to somewhere, some cells in our brain. It wakes them up. I suppose it's the preparation and the work that man put into what he did, you know.
And that concludes part one of our two-part series on Micheal O'Hare, born 100 years ago on Tuesday next, June the 2nd, 1920. And more from the O'Hare archives on Sunday morning next. We turn next to Micheal O'Hare, who was born 100 years ago on the 2nd of June 1920. We heard last week of his extraordinary impact on Gaelic games through the power of his radio commentaries.
Oh, what everybody was. We were spellbound by this man.
O'Hare had listeners who believed in his reporting. He had credibility.
If he was saying, and all the people on the moon at the moment, and we're sending best wishes to them, we'd believe, because Micheal O'Hare said there was people on the moon listening to the match.
This was despite the fact that he always insisted that his job was not necessarily to report the match, but to entertain the listeners.
That the match was a kind of an incidental. It was his material for making a very good broadcast.
This was not a commentary style which could survive television, and O'Hare made the mistake as head of sport when he decided to run his radio commentary as the soundtrack on the televised match throughout the 1960s. There was no specialist, minimalist TV commentary which that medium needs. Its demands are very different to those of radio. On the series This Match Is Not Over Yet, an 8-part documentary on the career of O'Hare and his impact on Croke Park, the television era is not really covered, whereas the early radio period is superbly captured. And this was O'Hare's golden age, of course, with communal listening to his radio commentary. Sean O'Shearcoin does allow himself an early insight.
If Micheal was a painter, he would be of the Impressionist school.
And this comes up again in the final episode of the radio series This Game Is Not Over Yet, when O'Hare talks to a man whom many saw as his successor, Micheal Muircehartaigh.
Remember not to alarm the mother and father or the financier, as they say, of a player, that it really does nothing. And, you know, I know people who are sticklers for sensationalism and the like wouldn't agree with that in modern times, but, you know, there's an awful lot of solid sense to it.
You still hold on to that philosophy?
I still, pretty well. You know, I don't think that it does anybody any good to say that so-and-so is being carried off with a split skull or something like that, you know. It doesn't, the same thing goes with racing. It doesn't do anyone any good. Let them find out when it's all over. For me, there's a job of work to be done. And I have to represent, and any commentator has to represent, the followers of both teams and the neutrals. And it's up to the commentator to do the job of telling what's down in under them.
Did you feel that you often conditioned young people to a type of game that maybe they didn't see when they went along to Croke Park or to Thurles or to...
Well, my idea of a radio commentator was then, is now, and always will be, that he is in a way an entertainer as well as a reporter. And if I go along to a game and it's very, very one-sided, and I say, you know, you're wasting your time listening into this game, it's useless, I'm not doing a job as a sports commentator. I think the good commentator should paint a scene. And I tell you something that's always a great guide to me, the crowd reaction. You know, sometimes you get a crowd going absolutely wild at the most dire game you ever could imagine. But when that crowd gets excited, trying to egg on the underdog, I would rise and would still rise to go along with them. And all this paints a certain colour of competition, because radio, as distinct from television, is in itself painting a picture that might at times be a little bit more colourful than the real picture that's down there below.
Micheal O'Hare, the centenary of whose birth falls just at this time. He was born in June 1920. He suffered a stroke in 1985, resulting in his total of all Ireland final broadcasts numbering 99, and he died